Alright, guys. So we're going to pick up the next chapter, the conquest era, which pretty much covers like all of Joshua, basically. The whole book of Joshua kind of bleeds a little bit into Judges a little bit. So just kind of and this would kind of be on the first one anyways, but just as far as a recap, we find ourselves as far as the Hebrews and the Israelite nation. They've been wandering in the desert for 40 years. Basically, a whole generation has passed away, essentially, from the time when they first came out of the desert and when they pretty much all sinned against God when they didn't enter the promised land the first time. And so we find them just to the east of the Jordan, basically across the Jordan from Jericho. Joshua is kind of here ready to assume command, essentially. So I kind of put a few things here, and I just kind of think it's interesting, but it very true. Joshua, obviously he's the next in command. He's the next to kind of take over and lead his people. But he kind of finds himself, I say a critical position, and kind of at a critical time. So they're at this kind of, I would almost say a breaking point in a sense. Moses just passed away, so he's been leading them for like over 40 years now, right? So he's been the mainstay. He's been the leader. The Bible says that people have been mourning for Moses for 30 days. So you could almost kind of say they're almost stagnant in a sense. They haven't really done anything. They've been sitting here mourning for Moses over the last 30 days. And really, they're kind of in the same exact position they were 40 years ago, right? Let's go enter the promised land. Like 40 years ago, they were at the same point in Kadesh Barnea, like, okay, let's go into the promised land, and they failed to go into the promised land. They turned and rejected God. And so they're kind of at the same position right here across the Jordan, basically to go into the promised land. And I thought it was interesting, if you see that one point, this is God speaking. He said, "And there rose not a prophet since in Israel like unto Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." And so God right there kind of said, like, there hasn't been a prophet, and he says there won't be, like Moses, like how Moses led the people, a guy I knew face to face. So Joshua kind of does have some big shoes. He has a big role to fulfill. And really consider the shoes that he was filling. Consider everything Moses had done and everything Moses had gone through, and now Joshua is going to lead the nation of Israel. And he himself, really had a decision to make himself, to assume this command, to take over, to take charge, and to lead the people. It's a choice that he had to make. Obviously, he was groomed for the position. I mean, he's been brought up under Moses' wing, essentially, the entire time, and he's kind of witnessed and experienced everything God has done. And he's probably one of the only few people, other than, I'm going to assume, Caleb, that probably has seen everything God's done since Egypt, right? If a whole generation has passed away in that 40 years, you're talking about Joshua, Caleb, does that sound right? Are probably the only two that are left that have actually experienced everything God's led and taken the people through from Egypt, really up to this point, because everybody else has passed away, everybody else is dead and gone. I mean, so you kind of have this new generation basically that Joshua is going to lead into the promised land. And so I kind of would say it's a critical point that they're at this point in time in the journey, basically to go again up into the promised land. Now, God obviously gives Joshua some encouraging words, which is always good. These are a few things that God just kind of spoke to Joshua, and you see this in the first chapter of Joshua. It says, "I will be with thee." It says, "I will not fail thee nor forsake thee." It says, "For the Lord thy God is with thee whithersoever so thou goest." And I just kind of thought about it, like we have those same promises as in the Bible. Like we still have these same promises from God, that he's with us, that he's walking beside us, that he's going with us. We've heard the saying, God's here to walk through the storm with us, right? He's going to go through. He's not going to lead us up into the storm and just kind of say, "See you later," and just let you go through it. He's there to walk through it with us, but we have to rely on him. We have to look to him. We have to trust in him and lean on him, even when it seems like he's not there. But we know he's right there. We know he's right beside us. And so God's kind of, he's giving, and in chapter 1, you see God giving this commission to Joshua, and you see him encouraging Joshua, telling him, like, "Hey, I'm going to be with you like I was with Moses. Like, I'm going to help you lead these people. I'm going to direct you. I'm going to guide you." And so he's encouraging Joshua, like, "Hey, let's do this. Let's go into the promised land," essentially is what he's telling Joshua. So, I'm going to do it a little different. What you guys know about Rahab? Huh? She was a harlot is what I heard. Come on.
But she
I want you guys to
helped
teach me a little bit.
So she befriended Caleb and Joshua and kind of let them escape, let them hide, I guess, right? And then help them escape.
Right. Anybody else? So, go ahead.
The reason Rahab helped the spies in the first place, because they didn't really have to convince her. It's more she saw them and pulled them into her home and understood what God was going to do. She understood who God was and what God was going to do, and that the Israelites were His chosen people, and she wanted to make sure that the Israelites and God knew that she was helping them.
They saved it. So, I just put some points. So, obviously, and I'll kind of just feed into it. So, before they cross the Jordan, before they go over into Jericho, Joshua sends out 2 spies, right? And he sends them to basically go spy out Jericho, see what it's like, see what's going on over there. The 2 spies encounter Rahab, who is or was a harlot. She takes them in. She takes them into her house. She actually conceals them. She helps them escape. And really, she kind of told them everything they needed to do to get out of there. I mean, they got in. She took them in. She hid them, basically, when the guards came through, kind of like searching. And they knew that they had come to Rahab, actually, because they were like, that's the first place they went. Like, who are these 2 men that came unto you, basically? And so she hid them. And then she told the guards, she said, hey, they were here, but they basically escaped. They went out this way. You need to go there and basically look for them and search for them, a couple days journey kind of thing. And so what she told the 2 spies is she told them, hey, I sent them off this way. You need to, once you get out, you need to go wait a couple days and then, return basically over to Joshua. Josh pointed out a point, and this is, I think, important too. Joshua 2:11, it says, for the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. And that was Rahab speaking. Okay? And what she told them, essentially what Josh was saying, is like, she recognized, she knew, like, hey, this is God's people. Like, they're coming here. Like, we kind of have, we're doomed, essentially, in a sense. But, like, she knew that this was the Lord, this was God. And so I think that's kind of important. Obviously, Israel was God's chosen people, right? And I kind of, if you think about the woman at the well, like when Jesus came here, He came for the Jews, right? But He didn't, He was directed toward the Jews, but there were still, He said, what did He tell the woman at the well? If I'm thinking right. Was it the well? Yeah. Or was it the one that said the breadcrumbs are even dropped down? But He basically said, I haven't seen a faith as great as yours, is what He said. But the point being, like, God was here. These were God's chosen people, but it wasn't that everybody else was excluded. Like, you see Rahab, she basically gets taken in. She converts, essentially, is what it is, and to Judaism, and as far as the Israelites and the Jewish nation. But you see, He still saved. He still, cared for other people. He still, even outside the Israelites. And the cool thing about Rahab, like, she's in the lineage of Jesus Christ. You guys know that? Like, Rahab. So Rahab was married. She was the wife of Solomon. She begat, I don't know if you say Boaz, however you say that, Boaz, who is in the lineage of Christ. And if you look back in Matthew chapter 1, that's where you see, basically, trace the lineage, and it shows the lineage of Christ. But she was the mother of Boaz, who was in that lineage. And so I just thought that was kind of a cool, interesting thing. I would assume that was because of her faithfulness, because of her trust, because of her belief, and who God was. And so it's just an interesting thing, a cool thing. And then, like Morgan said, so she let the spies down by a window, and basically, all she told the spies was like, hey, I'm going to help you out if you would just preserve me and my family. And what they told her was, hey, gather all your family into your household, basically when this all happens and when the Battle of Jericho starts. And she was to tie a scarlet thread, and that would basically identify her and her family essentially as the only people to not be killed, essentially, and the only people to escape Jericho at that point in time. You got something? Okay. And so that's just a cool thing. That's just an interesting thing about Rahab. So what's next? the crossing of the Jordan. So after this, they come back, they give this report, they kind of tell Joshua about Jericho, and now is the time basically for them to cross the Jordan, for them to go over and basically fight, do battle in Jericho, and conquer Jericho. So again, I thought it was kind of interesting. So I already said that we kind of have a new people, there's a new leader, and I say God starts off with a bang, but it's kind of interesting that one of the first things he did with them was part of water again. He parted the Jordan. And like one of the first things when they came out of Egypt was he parted the Red Sea. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. But really that's, obviously he's provided for them through the wilderness, so they've seen God's hand at work. But you see this parting of the water. So they cross roughly a 20-mile stretch across the Jordan, again, on dry ground, on dry land. And basically what happened, so the priests, they have the ark now, right? So if you, we didn't cover a ton of this, but all through, while they're in the wilderness, you saw God, after Moses came down from Mount Sinai, he gave him, all the plans, the directions to set up the tabernacle for the ark and everything like that. And so they have the ark now, and basically the priests carried the ark out into the Jordan. They stood in the middle of the Jordan and basically parted the Jordan. They stood there the whole time as the people passed over the Jordan. Just an interesting thing, Joshua set up 2 memorials at that time. He actually took 12 rocks from land, put it in the middle of the Jordan where the priests were, and he took 12 rocks out of the Jordan and set up a memorial on the other side. And I always think about this, and it's God's word, so I assume it's true. I say assume it's true. I know it's true. But it always says, he set up this memorial, and they've been there ever since. They haven't moved. And so I always think about, I say, are they still there? That's why I said assume, but I believe they're still there. The Bible says, it hasn't been moved. So I would say in the middle of the Jordan, there's 12 rocks as a memorial to God. And on the other side of the Jordan, somewhere, there's 12 rocks. That's a memorial to God. So I always thought that was interesting. I always think about that in my head. But so just a cool thing. And then also on that day, and I think this is another sign, another showing to Joshua, that God was with him. The Bible says on that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life. And so God really lifted up Joshua and kind of showed him this is my man, this is the guy that's going to be leading you. And so the people had a healthy fear of Joshua. And this is kind of interesting, but I thought it was funny. I said, what was their reward? As soon as they got across the Jordan, God told them, he said, okay, well, we got to circumcise everybody again. And so I was reading about it, and I was thinking about it, so they had a whole generation that passed away, and when they did that first circumcision, it was when they first came out of Egypt, right? And so all those people were dead and gone, and apparently they hadn't been following this command, essentially. And so they crossed the Jordan, and God's like, all right, well, now we got to circumcise everybody before we go into battle. I just kind of thought it was funny, but their faithfulness was rewarded with a circumcision. So they do that right after they cross the Jordan, and basically they're preparing for battle. The next big thing is really the Battle of Jericho. All right, you guys tell me what you know about Jericho. You guys speak up, Morgan. I can't hear you.
Marched around. Joshua was told to march them around the city walls 7 times and then blow the trumpet the last time.
So they went to Jericho. And basically, so they marched around the city. There were 7 days. The first 6 days they marched around once. So the priests carried the ark. They marched around the city. Pretty much everybody was quiet, and they just kind of marched around the city. All right. So they did that once every single day for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, they marched around the city 7 times. After the 7th time, they blew the trumps. The people shouted, and the city fell. The walls fell. And really, Israel utterly destroys all of Jericho. When I say everything, everything. Everyone in the city except Rahab, essentially. And I would imagine, I don't know, I would assume God did a lot of work when he destroyed the city. But it's it is a funny thing to think about it. I'm sure the people of Jericho were this is a joke. Nothing's going to happen. We're good. Everything's going to be fine. And so I'm sure that whole time it was kind of and I kind of wonder, when they did it the 7th time and they shouted, was it a delay? Was it wait for it, and then it destroyed, or like just everything came crumbling down real quick. But basically, they go up and they take this city, and this greatly fortified city. I tried to look up and just kind of see, because the Bible isn't specific about it, like what was Jericho like? What were the walls like? How high was it? I didn't find anything. The only thing I'll say, and you can tell me what you found. The only things I found, they were talking about it. It's not like it. Based on what I read, it wasn't like a huge thing, but it was, 15-foot walls, probably towers that were 20 feet or so, kind of high. That's just kind of stuff I found. Have you looked into it?
Well, I want to talk about the marching.
Yeah.
Skeptics I've listened to have talked about how, explaining that it wasn't God that did this, saying that it was them marching around in a set pattern and causing like an earthquake. But that's the usual comments that I hear.
But obviously
that
that's
could be explained if the walls were regular walls, like regular city walls back then. But these, and this is going into the wall part, Rahab's home was in one of the walls. So the walls were at least as thick enough, wide enough to hold a home and a family. And I can only assume that all of the walls were that big. So no matter how many people you've got marching around the city once per day, and then 7 times on the 7th day, it's not going to make these things fall. They're not even going to think about moving.
a good point. But yeah, so she was, and that's interesting. I didn't think about it, but so, and like I said, I found different pictures, I found different things. I mean, there's all different kinds of stuff that you can probably find on it, but nothing specific. But so they do come up, they take over Jericho essentially. Joshua essentially burns that whole city. What was the one command they were given?
Kill everything. Don't take anything.
Yeah. So kill everything. Don't touch anything. Like basically destroy everything. That's the only thing they were told to do. Destroy the city, and don't remove or take anything. Obviously, we know that happened, right? And I put pride and sin, because so the people come up, they conquer this great city, really all by God's hand, but they really, and God says this himself later on when you see him dividing out the lands, he pretty much said to them, I've given you lands that you haven't done much for, in a sense. Like God pretty much, obviously he fights a lot of their battles, all their battles, but God gives them this city. And the very next thing, what we see, right after they conquer Jericho, is there's this city right beside them called Ai. There's a few people that kind of start going that way. They see that this city of Ai is they're like, hey, it's only a couple thousand people, like it's nothing, this would be super easy for us to conquer. And they tell Joshua this, and he's like, okay, well, let's just send a few people there. Let's just send, part of our army there, and we'll win this battle easily. But what happens? They send them running, after their tails. And so they run back. They basically are utterly defeated. And really it's kind of, hurts their morale, because they're like, oh, how did we just lose this small battle when we just conquered Jericho? And there are a couple things, one of the things that happened was Joshua failed to consult God at all about it. Like at first he was like, oh, let's just go conquer this city. Let's just go fight it. And then obviously one of the big things was the sin of one. Who's the one that sinned? Achan. So it was the sin of one man that basically held the whole nation of Israel back. And I think that's an interesting thing. And you hear Sam say this a lot. He talks about it within our church and within our congregation he talks about saying like how one person could hold the church back. Like one person's, whether it's their sin, something going on in their life could hold the church back. And it kind of proves the point right here that it is possible that one person could hold us back from something. And so it's just an interesting thing to think about that. But we see that in Achan. So Achan obviously took some gold, he took some silver, he hid it in his tent, and because of his sin, Israel lost this, we'll say, simple battle that could have been. And so what did God do to Achan? Like he killed him, but he like destroyed he killed his whole family. Like it wasn't like just Achan was punished. Like God brought all the tribes of Israel before Joshua revealed who it was, and basically it took all of Achan's family and wiped them from the face of the earth. Like killed them all. Like his livestock, everything. They killed everything that was his. And so, sometimes I think about it, but it's just as true for us. Sometimes in the Old Testament you read and you see like they sin and you see God's punishment, and sometimes you're like, man, like that was kind of severe in a sense. But the punishment for our sin is just as severe, even worse. I mean, it's hell. Our punishment for our sin is hell, and eternity is separated from God. And so it's just as severe. And the Bible also tells us that, tells us to be sure our sin finds us out. God will, reprimand us on this earth for sin. I don't know that it's necessary death. It could be actually, but He will reveal our sin and punish us for our sin on this earth too. So it's just important that when we do sin, we always hear keep a short account with God, that we bring it before God, that we keep our fellowship with God, and so we're in right standing with Him. And then I put this verse from Isaiah 55. It says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord." And so I put that just thinking about the fact that, they just conquered Jericho just by marching around the walls. But when they go to Ai, which was a small city, God told them, He said, take everybody. Like, just take the whole army. Like, He didn't say, take a few people and go conquer them. Like, He said, I want you to take the whole army and go conquer them. And now, I was thinking about what Sam's been preaching on with Gideon. When he went up to battle to fight, and Sam said roughly 500,000, maybe 1 million people. They only took a few thousand people, right, to go fight them. And the point being, one, God's ways are not our ways, His thoughts are not our thoughts, and God wants to show His hand. Like, they could have gone up and just conquered these people with a few thousand people, but what would they have thought? Oh, we did this. Like, we just conquered these people. No, God said, I want you to take everybody and destroy them.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if you saw.
Okay.
I wanted to talk about Achan.
Yeah.
And point that toward our lives, where every day as Christians we fight a spiritual battle. We're in spiritual warfare, and we like to have that one sin, where it's okay, I've got that covered, but it's that one sin that's going to prevent God from completing what He has for our lives. It's that one sin that's going to keep us from getting to where God wants us to be. And we need to completely wipe out that sin in order to get to where God wants us to be, in order to move forward. And then with the AI city, I read that as when God wants us to go somewhere, He doesn't want us to just kind of half-heartedly
Go
move
do
in
it.
that direction. He wants 100% of us to, He wants us to put 100% of what we have into what His goal is for us.
I think I mentioned this. Go ahead.
Okay, well, if you want to keep going.
Yeah.
Something else, that I want to talk about. We talked a minute ago about the punishment for Achan and what he did. And you mentioned something about it seeming severe, right? I think we have a tendency to look back on a lot of things God did in the Old Testament as far as punishments for sin, and we have a tendency to think of them as severe. And that's usually because we have a wrong perspective on what sin is and what it is. And we've got to understand and remember that our sin, what we are sinning against, we're sinning against a perfect being, and how severe that sin truly is. And that's just us. When we feel that way, it's more of us minimizing what sin is and trying to make it smaller than what it really is. And we all have a tendency to do that. But I think if we understand and have the right perspective on what sin truly is against a holy and perfect God, then we'll better understand or be able to cope with the severity of some of the punishments He deals out, specifically throughout the Old Testament, and then coming forth and around Armageddon and everything will be end times. It's easier, I think, in a sense, to cope with it, if I can use the right words.
Well, and I think this is comes naturally. We like to compare everything, and so obviously we always but my sin's not as great as their sin, or I only did this, and they did, but the Bible, the Bible tells us he who compares himself among men is not wise. The Bible also tells us if you've committed one sin, you've committed all sin. Like, it doesn't matter what the sin was, and it doesn't, as far as, salvation and heaven and hell and things like that, it's one sin. Like, he doesn't say if you commit this many sins, then you're condemned to hell, or if you commit this sin, this one sends you to hell. Like, it's any sin. Like, and so probably from the time we're a couple of years old, like, once we get that knowledge of good and evil, I would imagine one of our very first sins is disobeying our parents. Like, it's got to be something like that for each and every one of us. Like, just not listening to your parents, and that's it. Like, that's your first sin. Like, that's it. Like, you're done for. Like, obviously you can get saved, but like, it's something just as small as that. It's not, that we went out and committed murder at 5. Like, it's something small in a sense. We say small. Again, I keep using the word small. It's sin. It's sin to sin. And so we do like to compare it, to justify it among ourselves, to make ourselves feel better about what we may or may not be doing wrong, kind of thing. And then it kind of makes us feel like, oh, I'm not that bad, is what it is. I'm a pretty good person.
You got to get the proper perspective on what it is, what you've done, and who you've done it to. When you have that, I think you have a better understanding of how bad. You hear all the time about older people where they walk with Christ, and when they learn about the depravity, when they understand that they are sinners by nature. They don't really get they become aware of their doing.
To kind of go on what you were talking about with sin, the punishment for sin, no matter where we look in the Bible, the punishment for sin has always been death. And it's always been some kind of extreme death. For us, it's been Christ's death on the cross, and that was extreme. So when we look in the Old Testament, we see people swallowed up, and we see the family stoned. That's the punishment for sin.
For the wages of sin is death, but the gift of God is eternal life. The Bible tells us it. So, good stuff, guys. So, following from there, so they do conquer Ai, and so we see them get tricked. Do you guys remember what happens with Joshua and them? So the Gibeonites, basically everybody in the land starts to hear about Israel. They hear about this conquering of Jericho. They hear, they're like, oh, like, something's coming, like something's happening. Like, they kind of start to have a little bit of fear in them. And so the Gibeonites, they essentially trick Joshua and Israel. They come to Joshua, basically they're like, hey, let's go make a league with Joshua. Let's kind of get an alliance with them so like we don't get destroyed, essentially, is what it is. And so they're, if you look at it, and I got a map of it, they're really not that far from where they are. But they send some people to Joshua, and they send these people basically in rags. They dress up in rags. Their shoes are all weathered. They bring moldy bread and stuff like that. And they come to Joshua, and they're like, hey, we've traveled from a far, far land, across the world. We want to make an alliance with you. We want to, we don't want to get destroyed. God, we understand your God is the one true God. And so they trick Joshua and them to make an alliance with him. They basically say hey, we're not going to destroy you, but you, and essentially they kind of are servants in a sense to them. But in all reality, they find out one battle later that the Gibeonites are right here. These people that just tricked them into alliance, who God told them to destroy, basically tricked them into this alliance with them. And obviously they recognize this alliance. But the one thing I thought about when this all happened, and again, as you read it, and I kind of, you never see, you don't see Joshua and them consult God again. They looked on the outward appearance of these people and oh, they must be telling us the truth. They must have just journeyed for a couple of months across the desert to get to us, to make this alliance. And so they were looking at the outward appearance of a man, which can be deceiving and is deceiving, but God looks on the inside. God knows the heart. And I would imagine if they would have consulted God, that God would have revealed to Joshua, or would have told them hey, this isn't true, this is a lie. They're not speaking honestly with you, kind of thing. And so I think And we'll talk about it a little bit, but I think this plays into some of the further downfalls of Israel down the road, of the Hebrew people and the nation as far as the promised land goes and conquering the promised land. So here, I put the conquest on here. So here's a map. I got to stand, maybe, there you go. So if you look at it, I don't know how well you guys can see it. For some reason, this doesn't work on the TV. But this map, it basically has all the different kind of nations listed in the promised land, like the Philistines, the Hittites, the Canaanites, the Hivites, all these ites, basically. And so it just kind of shows their general area. So when you're, and this might be a good map if you ever want to have it up or look at it when you're reading, like when it's talking about, hey, they're conquering this people, or they're going here, and this is who they're fighting and battling and stuff like that. So it kind of shows basically throughout the promised land where everybody was located. And then the red was where they were kind of camped on the other side of the Jordan there. And then this map, just a cool little map, shows the battles and basically shows the direction in which Joshua and Israel went. So after this, essentially, they just go on this, I say rampage, but just conquering. They literally just went and conquered and battled and fought and won and won and won and just wiped out these people and destroyed these people. If you look at it, let me see if I can get it to do it. Oh, it's a bummer. All right, so they went across the Jordan, and essentially they went, Ai is kind of right there in the middle, and they went towards the Mediterranean Sea this way, and then they came down towards the south, is what they did, and then basically they kind of loop back up and go up north as far as like conquering the lands. And so again, that's essentially, I don't know, the next couple of chapters of Joshua really is just them battling and fighting and going on and going on. And, no matter what these other nations tried to do, they tried to come together in leagues to fight the Israelites, kings and other kings and kings. There's nothing they could do. Again, it was the hand of God. It was God fighting these battles for them. And I think it's interesting, I've heard this multiple times, and I've read this before, they say, like, military colleges study the battles of Joshua, like, that they read and they study on Joshua. And I think it's funny because, like, what are you going to learn from the Battle of Jericho? Like, how many militaries are going to go in circles around the city and expect everything just to fall and crumble? And I personally, I think, like, they read and they study Joshua's battles probably because they were unbelievable as far as, like, what he was up against and what he fought and what he battled. But it's almost like they want to know how God, you can only be explained by God, like by God's hand, by God's doing. Like, it doesn't make sense from a military, probably strategy, purpose, like odds that Joshua and the nation of Israel would just wipe out the whole land and conquer a whole land by themselves, given what they were up against.
I will say, from being in the Marines, they do, at least what I knew, they do study Joshua. And despite what current politics try to say, there's a lot of prayer. There's a lot of God being worshipped. And whenever they go, and it has a lot to do with what the soldiers and the Marines have seen on the battlefield that is completely unexplainable. And they walk out alive because of that thing that was unexplainable. And the only thing that they can think of is, this happened in the Bible, this happened today, I'm going to start praying, and just, like, revival breaks out. And I really think that that's what keeps a lot of ours alive today, is the fact that they continue to pray, they continue to praise, and they continue to seek God despite what the current political status is saying.
You made me think about something. That's just important in our life. Like we said, we're in a spiritual battle every day. Every day, like, we're in a battle. And that's just prayer is as important in our lives for our battles each and every day. But I think about it, and it's something that's always in my prayers about just God's hedge of protection around my family and around us and things like that. I was driving to work the other day, and I told Claire this. I was just driving, and there were two instances. There was a guy flying around the corner, and I was just thinking, if this guy just came an inch over that line, he would have just hit me head on and just would have been bad, kind of thing. And then, like, not 2 seconds later, a guy tried to pass like four cars on a double yellow, and I was like, in my head, I was like, what an idiot. But, like, I was like, if I was down the road just a little bit further, like I would have had to slam on my brakes to maybe not hit him because he would have been blocked in by 3 other cars. Like, and so I was just thinking about how, you know, how precious life is, how, I mean, it could be over like that. But, you know, we think about this, and I think we hear this all the time, like, you know, God delaying us a minute, or God doing, you know, just, that's God's hand. Like, you know, if you're down the road a few more seconds, you know, like, you would have been the one in the accident, you would have been the one in this, that would have happened. And so, like, I don't think we always think about it as being the unexplainable kind of thing, but it's God's hand at work. Like, it's God protecting us. It's God having his hand upon us, you know, keeping us safe, keeping our family safe. And I think we see that probably all the time with little instances and different things, you know, how that could have been a lot worse, or something else could have happened if this or if that kind of thing. He can talk.
I was kind of trolling Facebook earlier this week, and a question popped up saying, how many times has God moved in your life in a way that you haven't recognized? How many times has God intervened in your life that you haven't noticed? What about the flat tire on the side of the road that you would have been in a car wreck if you kept driving? Or you were 5 minutes late to work, but you're still alive.
Right.
Because of something else that would have happened if you kept driving. Stuff like that.
It's true. I don't think we recognize it enough. So basically from here, what we find is, so I said they kind of go out, they conquer essentially most of the land in reality. And at this point in time, after they get done battling, conquering, Joshua, who is basically old in age at this point, God kind of tells Joshua, like, all right, it's time for us to kind of like settle down. It's time, you know, your time's coming. We're going to divide the lands among the tribes of Israel. Do you know what the tribes who took land on the east of the Jordan were? Does anybody know the 2 tribes? Well, 2.5. So the tribe of Reuben and the tribe of Gad and the half tribe of Manasseh. So there were 3 tribes before they even crossed in the promised land. They had gone to Moses and said, hey, we want land over here, basically, is kind of what it was. So there were a couple of tribes, but Moses said, you know, Moses made them promise, like, when we go up into the promised land, you're going, like, your warriors, your men are going to battle and fight. And so if you, I put this question here, it says, was the land conquered? Do you know if all the lands were conquered when they were done battling at this point in time?
No, because they had to make deals.
It wasn't done. If you read in Joshua chapter 13, God says, and he tells them, like, hey, and he does give them a time of rest. He says, hey, you know, let's divide the lands out. But he says there's still the Philistines. There's still the kings here. And it's really, it was quite a good list of lands that are still not conquered yet. There's still some people here, basically, that we are going to battle, that we are going to fight, that still need to be conquered. But God even says, he says, I'm going to leave these for a test, is what he told Joshua. He said, these are going to be for a test for these people going forward. And so there is still a land that's not completely conquered yet. Now, they had battled and they had fought, you know, and battled and, you know, given, and here's the map is what you'll see. And again, it's kind of hard to see it there. But all the red kind of, it lays out what the lands and where they were given and who had what portion and everything like that. You see on the right side is where Reuben, Gad, Manasseh. And so through Joshua 13 through chapter 21, you see basically God and Joshua dividing out the lands. This is, you know, who's getting what, basically. Now, and like I said, Joshua 21:44, it says God gave the people rest. So he gave them a season of rest. You know, he gave them a season to like kind of enjoy, to live, and to be at rest, not at war, after they had divided the lands out. And so, again, Joshua's kind of at the end of his life, and Joshua dies at the end of the book of Joshua at 110 years old. But Joshua 23 through 24, I said there were there were still lands that were unconquered. The Bible says that they divided lots out to about these lands, like who was going to have the land that wasn't, you know, certain areas of the land that was not conquered yet. And Joshua kind of, you know, Joshua and God, but he kind of gives them some kind of last commands, you know, a last will, if you will. And he tells the people, hey, you need to keep following the Lord your God. Like, you need to be searching, serving, looking to God. He tells them, this is kind of one of the big things, and again, this ends up being the biggest downfall. He tells them not to marry outside of their nation, essentially. Don't worship other gods. And then he gave them, all of chapter 24 was basically a summary of all of God's miracles, his hand, basically from Egypt to this point in time. He kind of gave them a review of like, this is what God's done. This is what God did at the Red Sea. This is what, basically everything God had done for them. And then Joshua 24:31, it says, and Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that overlived Joshua, and which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. And I put this verse in there, and I put under it, this is why we're always one generation from the gospel being removed and extinct. Because what you see, and time and time again, you see this in Israel, you see them, okay, Joshua was around, the people that saw everything that Joshua saw, the elders, they kept serving God, and then they all died, and then it's like chaos breaks loose. They turn their back from God because it's like they forget everything that God had done for them. And so, that goes in, and I put that up there because, we have to pass on the gospel to our children, and their faith is not our faith. Our faith can't be their faith. They have to develop, and they have to have their own faith, their own convictions, their own, they have to be following God for them to stay steady, to keep following God, really for the gospel to keep going and going and going. Because if they don't, it's just the same thing that happened to Israel time and time again. Like, they serve, people die, and it's like, okay, well, what do we do? Who's God now, kind of thing. Like, they just completely forget everything that has to do with God. So I put, so what happens next? And I'm going to put, I put disobedience, fail, epic fail. They kept failing. But they got to see God's grace. They got to see God's mercy. I mean, literally what happened is, they were told, and I'm going to put this map up. You see this in red? If you read the Bible and you read what the promised land was, that's all the promised land. It was way more than what they had. It was way more than what they were given. There was a lot of land still to be conquered. And if you go into Judges, what you see, the first thing after Joshua's dead and gone, the elders are dead and gone, the tribe of Judah, they say, like, what do we do now? And essentially is what they ask God, like, what do we do? What are we supposed to do? And God says, I want Judah to go up and fight the Canaanites. The first thing Judah says, he goes to Simeon and says, hey, will you come fight the Canaanites with us? But God didn't tell Simeon to go fight the Canaanites. He said, Judah, I want you to go to fight the Canaanites. And then the next three, little sections is disobedience of the tribes of Israel. It says each of them are titled incomplete victory. They had a victory over the land, but they didn't kill everybody. They had a victory, but they left a remnant of the people. And basically that remnant of those people is what really becomes their downfall. They start intermarrying with basically outside of the tribe of Israel. And that's what led to false worship, other gods, because all these other nations had all their other gods. They had all their other religion, if you will, and things that they were doing. And that ultimately led to kind of the downfall, in a sense, is what I'm saying. But from this time, because they didn't really, I put what should have been, like, this is what could have been if they just kept doing what the Lord told them, if they had basically conquered and destroyed the people they were supposed to destroy. Like, they were promised all this land. Now, one day they're going to get all this land. We know that's a promise to be fulfilled, and it will happen, but basically because of their sin, and the same thing kind of with us, and it's really our sin breaks our fellowship with the Lord, and hinders us from, we'll say, being complete in a sense as far as what God has in our life. Josh mentioned that, like, he has a plan for us, he has something for us to do, but it needs to be 100% of us for 100% of him. It needs to be us all in to really, it's not that God can't use you and that he won't use you, but will you fulfill that potential that you were given, that potential that God has in store for you? We studied Samson not too long ago. Like, he was given great strength and great powers, but he squandered a lot of his potential and what he could have done. And the judge, and we're going to get into Judges, but the judge he could have been for the nation of Israel by disobedience, by sin, by breaking God's commands. And so we have that same thing in our lives. Like, he has a plan, we have a potential, but are we going to fulfill that, for him and serving him? Any questions? We made it. Just barely.
I just kept having a thought about the Canaanites. Once you kind of talked about the deception and all that, and I just kept recurrently hearing just totally disregarded it is that God continuously communicated with them. Everything that they needed to know through leadership or, whatever, but that there was no communication about the giving rights. He didn't say, hey, there's going to be men that come to you from this. I mean, that's been the type of communication that they had come to expect. And it's almost like, well, I can do it myself, it's fine. This is not that big of a deal. They look like, old bread. And it's no big deal. We'll make a deal with these guys. But they just disregarded the fact that there had been no communication. God didn't let them know what was coming like he had all the other times. And it just makes me think about the times that I have jumped the gun in the things that I know that I'm supposed to be doing, but the time wasn't right, or it was just not supposed to be yet. And it just is totally relatable for what they ended up doing, what happened. But they just disregarded all of the communication they expected.
It's kind of like, and I kind of similar, is like when we do something and we want God to bless it after the fact kind of thing, or like when you say jump the gun, like this seems good and it can be good and whatnot, but we don't ever really seek God's wisdom or counsel on it, and so we just go and do it, and then like things don't seem to work out how they should, and then we're kind of like, oh God, will you help me out of this situation, or will you bless this thing even though I didn't come to you first, kind of thing about it. And so I mean, and the point I think the point that's being made is like why we should be in constant communication with God, like, and more than just like, hey, I pray to God like in the morning or during my Bible study, but like communication throughout the day. Like communication doesn't have to always be like I'm just sitting in prayer. Like you can talk to God, you can converse to God, like, and so why we should be in that constant communication, because he will tell us, he will lead us, he will guide us and show us like where we need to be or where we need to go. And then obviously when it comes to big decisions, like it should never be something that we just jump into without seeking God's counsel on it, even if it means we got to wait a little bit to make a decision on it, kind of thing, because then you'll either have the comfort of knowing like, hey, this is right, or you'll have the conviction about like, maybe this isn't quite as good or as what it seems to be, kind of thing.
I think we have a habit of, during God's silences, that we start going and kind of seeking other opinions instead of just accepting that God hasn't said go yet, or he hasn't said don't go yet. It's just, be still and know that I'm God. And it's okay to just be.
Right.
But, in this day and age especially, I think if we're not doing something, we feel like I'm wasting time, or there's got to be something I'm supposed to be doing, and sometimes it's just hurry up and wait.
The counsel of men seems to be better a lot of times, right? And plus you get an immediate response, and then I'm not saying, hopefully our good friends will tell us if we're not supposed to be doing something, but a lot of times it's easier for people, especially friends, to be like, oh yeah, like that's a good idea, or it's a good thing, or like, and not that it's a bad thing, but like I tell patients this all the time, like when I talk to them about depression, anxiety, like, oh yeah, I do therapy with my family. Well, your family could really hinder you just by patting you on the back and telling you everything's good and this and that. That's why you need an outside perspective or kind of thing. But like, but that's sometimes as like friends, it's easier to be like, oh yeah, that seems good, or that's great, or to kind of pat someone along the way. And even if it is a good thing, doesn't mean it's God's will, God's plan, God's direction, and that's why it is. We need to be still. We need to be listening. We need to hear that still, quiet voice of the Lord to know, like, this is what He wants us to do, and that should be our authority, like that's the final word. Like that's the only one that matters. So even if everybody else is telling you yes and He's telling you no, the answer should be no.
Well, it could be the right opinion in the wrong time.
Right.
I mean, people could give you good, sound counsel, but the timing just isn't right.
Right.
for to act on it. It's just-
All right, they're out there. Let's close. Heavenly Father, Lord, I thank you for this day and this time together. Lord, I thank you for your word. I thank you for just allowing us to study Joshua, Lord. And I just thank you that you do give us counsel. You give us direction all along the way, Lord. I just pray that we would be faithful to seek you and to search you and to know what that is, Lord, and that we would trust in your direction, your will, and your leading, Lord, and that we wouldn't seek outside counsel apart from you, Lord, and that we would go to you first, Lord. And I just pray, like we mentioned, you have a plan, you have a direction, you have something to accomplish in us, Lord. I just pray that we would be willing to put all of us into that plan, 100% of us for 100% of you, just to follow and trust in you, Lord. I just pray for each and every one here, Lord. I pray for their families, Lord. I pray that you would just be with them throughout this week, be with those that are starting school. Just give them a good school year. Just watch over them and protect them. I pray all this in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.